The city shimmered under the rainy day, its glass towers gleaming like silver spears thrust into the clouds. Outside the towering headquarters of Lansing Global Holdings, a luxury black Bentley sat waiting, polished so perfectly it reflected the faces of the curious onlookers who dared not step too close. Richard Lansing, the billionaire CEO, emerged from the revolving doors, flanked by assistants in crisp suits. His watch, a platinum Patek Philippe, caught the light as he checked the time impatiently. "Where's my car?" he asked, though it was right before him. The chauffeur rushed to open the door. "Mr. Lansing," a timid voice called out from behind the iron gate that separated the company plaza from the street. The voice was small, uncertain, yet it carried across the polished stone like a note that refused to fade. Richard ignored it at first. He had an investor call in 10 minutes, a flight to London that evening. But the voice came again, this time closer. "Sir, excuse me, sir." He turned, irritated. A boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, stood barefoot near the gate, clutching a torn backpack. His dark skin was streaked with dust, his jeans too short at the ankles. Behind him, traffic roared, and the smell of exhaust and street food mixed in the hot air. Security moved immediately. "Hey, you can't be here." One guard barked, moving toward the boy. But the child didn't run. He just stared at Richard, not with fear but with something like recognition. "Please, mister," he said softly. "I think you dropped this." He held out a small, crumpled envelope, the kind that might have slipped from Richard's briefcase earlier. Richard frowned. He didn't remember losing anything. The guard snatched the envelope from the boy and handed it back to him. "Scram, kid." But as Richard took it, his brow furrowed. The envelope had his company's embossed seal. It was his. Inside were 2 handwritten notes, one from a foundation he'd been too busy to read, and another, smaller one, addressed to R. Lansing. Urgent. Richard hesitated. "Where did you find this?" The boy looked down. "In the trash bin near your building. I thought, maybe it was important." The CEO glanced at his assistant, annoyed that something like this could have been thrown away. "Thank you," he said curtly, turning to leave. But before he could step into the Bentley, the boy spoke again. "Sir, are you the man who owns this building?" Richard turned. "Yes." "Why?" The boy's lips trembled. "My mom used to clean your floors. A hush fell around them. Even the chauffeur froze." Richard blinked. "Used to?" The child nodded. "They fired her 2 weeks ago. She said it's okay, but she cries at night." His voice cracked, but he didn't cry. "She said she wasn't fast enough to clean the offices before the morning people came." The assistant stepped forward, whispering, "Sir, we should go." But Richard wasn't listening anymore. The boy shifted his weight, his small hands gripping the strap of his torn backpack. "I just wanted to ask, can you give her job back?" Richard's expression hardened. "That's not how these things work, son. Tell her to contact HR." "She did," the boy said simply. "They told her to stop calling." For the first time, Richard had no ready reply. Around them, the traffic noise faded into a distant hum. The boy's eyes, wide, honest, and unblinking, looked straight into his. "Sir," the child whispered, his voice trembling yet strong. "You don't remember her, do you? She said she once brought you coffee when your meeting ran late. She said you smiled at her and told her she was doing great work." Richard's chest tightened. He had said that, years ago maybe. He couldn't recall her face, only that he used to pass dozens of cleaning staff without ever really seeing them. Then the boy said the word that froze him where he stood, one simple word that hit harder than any accusation. "Promise." Richard blinked. "What?" "You promised," the boy said, his voice quivering but certain. "She told me you promised to remember people like her. That's what she said the night she got fired. She said rich men make promises they forget, but I told her maybe not all of them." The word echoed inside Richard like a thunderclap. Promise. The Bentley door remained open, the city waiting. His assistant's phone buzzed with the incoming call from London, but Richard didn't move. For the first time in years he felt seen, not as a CEO, not as a man of power, but as someone who had failed to keep his word. The boy turned to leave, his small figure vanishing into the moving crowd. But Richard's voice, quieter now, followed him. "Wait, what's your name?" The child turned back. "Eli," he said, "Eli Thompson," and then he was gone. Richard stood still beside his car, the envelope heavy in his hand. The note inside suddenly mattered more than his meetings, more than his reputation, more than his billions. For the first time in a long time, the man who owned everything felt something he hadn't felt since his youth. Shame. And somewhere deep inside, a long-buried memory began to stir. That night, the city lights stretched beneath Richard Lansing's penthouse like a sea of fireflies trapped in glass. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, untouched glass of bourbon in hand, replaying the word over and over in his head. Promise. He couldn't shake the sound of it, the way the boy, Eli, had said it. Not as a threat, not as a demand, but as if he still believed Richard might remember. He placed the drink down, unopened. Across the room, his assistant's voice echoed faintly from the speakerphone. "Sir, the London deal is waiting for your signature. The investors—" "Delay it," Richard said flatly. "Delay, sir. You heard me." He ended the call before the assistant could protest. The silence that followed was deafening. He hadn't done that in years. His whole career was built on precision, control, discipline. He didn't delay anything. But something about that boy's voice had cracked the surface of his certainty. He turned toward his desk. The envelope, the one Eli had handed him, lay there. He opened it again. Inside was a letter from the Lansing Promise Foundation, one of his company's philanthropic branches. It was supposed to help employees' families in hardship. The irony wasn't lost on him. The handwritten note attached read, "Mr. Lansing, we've had several complaints about the new cleaning contractors. Some long-time employees were dismissed without review. We recommend personal oversight. One of them, a Mrs. Thompson, has been calling our office daily." H.R. Richard's stomach twisted. "Mrs. Thompson." He sank into his chair. He remembered now, barely. She'd been one of the early hires when he started the company. Always polite, always early. He remembered her laugh, soft, nervous, but kind. And once, during an all-nighter before a product launch, she'd brought him a coffee. He'd told her, "People like you keep this place running." And apparently, he'd made a promise. He rubbed his temple. Why can't I remember saying it? But the guilt was already there, a sharp, metallic taste in the back of his throat. He grabbed his phone and dialed a number from the letterhead. After a few rings, a weary voice answered. "Lansing Foundation, this is Karen. This is Richard Lansing." There was a pause. "Mr. Lansing." "Sir, of course. What can I do for you?" "I want the file on a Mrs. Thompson. She used to work in janitorial services." "Ah, yes, I think I saw her name. Let me check." The keyboard clicked rapidly. "Yes, sir. She was terminated 3 weeks ago. Performance issues, according to management." "Who signed off?" "A subcontractor, TriMet Cleaners. They took over our cleaning department last quarter. Why?" Richard's jaw tightened. "Get me her address." "Sir, company policy doesn't allow me to." He cut her off. "Then break policy." His voice was low, commanding, the voice that had built an empire. Within minutes he had the address scribbled on a notepad. An hour later, his Bentley was back on the road, slicing through the city's sleeping streets. The driver tried to make small talk, but Richard waved him silent. He needed to think. The car stopped in front of a narrow apartment block on the city's east side, a neighborhood far from the polished world of executives and boardrooms. The building's paint peeled, the street lamps flickered weakly. He told the driver to wait and stepped out, adjusting his coat against the night chill. Inside, the hall smelled of mildew and old newspapers. He climbed the creaking stairs and stopped at apartment 3B. From inside came the faint sound of a child humming, the same voice that had stopped him cold that afternoon. He knocked gently. There was a pause. Then a woman's voice, cautious and tired. "Who is it?" "Mrs. Thompson?" The door opened slightly. A woman in her 30s stood there, her hair tied back, dark circles under her eyes. Her uniform, faded and frayed, suggested she'd just come from another job. When she saw him, her eyes widened. "Mr. Lansing?" she whispered, disbelief in her voice. He nodded. "May I come in?" She hesitated, glancing at the sleeping form of Eli on a couch behind her. Then she opened the door. The apartment was small, one bedroom, peeling wallpaper, a table stacked with bills. On the wall hung a single framed photo, a smiling man in military uniform, arm around her shoulders. "I'm sorry for coming unannounced," Richard said quietly. "I wanted to ask about your termination." She gave a soft, bitter laugh. "Ask." "You're 3 weeks late, sir. They said I wasn't keeping up. Guess 40 floors of glass doesn't clean itself." He looked around. The exhaustion in her eyes told the whole story. The unpaid bills, the extra shifts, the quiet endurance. "You used to bring me coffee," Richard said suddenly. "You told me once I should slow down or I'd burn myself out." Her lips parted in surprise. "You remember that?" He nodded, barely. "But your son reminded me today. He said you told him I made you a promise." For the first time she looked away. "I didn't mean for him to bother you. He still believes people keep their word." Richard's voice softened. "And you don't?" She laughed quietly, a tired, humorless sound. "Sir, people like us can't afford to believe in promises. We survive on what we can see, not what we're told." Richard stood silent for a long moment, the weight of her words pressing against the silence. Then he said, "I'm reinstating you, personally, and not as a cleaner, as the head of maintenance operations, full benefits, starting tomorrow." Her eyes filled instantly. "Mr. Lansing, No, don't thank me," he interrupted gently. "I'm just trying to remember what a promise means." She looked at him then, truly looked. "Maybe it's not too late to remember, sir." As he turned to leave, Eli stirred on the couch, blinking sleepily. His small voice filled the room. "Mom? Who's that?" She smiled through her tears. Just someone who finally kept his word. Outside, as Richard stepped back into the Bentley, the city lights didn't seem so cold anymore. For the first time in years, he felt something stir inside him. Not guilt this time, but resolve. And the night whispered the same word again. Promise. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the glass towers of Lansing Global Holdings, bouncing off mirrored windows that once made Richard proud. Today, they only reminded him of reflection, something he had avoided for too long. He arrived early, before the staff, before the noise. For years, he'd begun his days by checking numbers, market trends, stock rises, quarterly gains. But today, the only thing on his mind was a promise. He sat in his office, the silence almost sacred. On his desk lay a printed notice, reinstatement, Mrs. Angela Thompson. His signature gleamed in black ink at the bottom, but even as he read it, he knew the gesture wasn't enough. The issue wasn't one woman's job. It was the system that had let her fall through the cracks. When his assistant, James, entered, he stopped short. "Sir, you're here early. I need a list of every employee we terminated through TriMet Cleaners," Richard said. James frowned. "That'll be hundreds of names." "Then start with 10, Richard replied, his tone calm but firm. "And bring me the details of the Foundation's grant denials for the last 6 months." James hesitated. "Are you planning an audit?" Richard leaned back, his eyes distant. "No, a reckoning." He looked toward the skyline, the city that worshipped his company, his wealth, his ambition. But now, all he saw was how easily he'd let success blind him. The very people who built his empire had become invisible. By noon, the reports arrived, pages upon pages of terminations. Behind every name, a reason, inefficiency, attendance, outsourcing, words that erased lives. He stopped reading at one line. Thompson, Angela, terminated, restructuring, unsatisfactory cleaning pace. His jaw clenched. He turned the page, but his eyes blurred. Every sentence, every corporate excuse felt like a confession. A knock interrupted him. "Sir," James said, "Mrs. Thompson is here to see you." Richard rose slowly. "Send her in." Angela entered, dressed modestly but neatly, her hair pulled back, her eyes wary. For a moment she stood at the door, uncertain whether to approach the man who had once seemed untouchable. "Mrs. Thompson," Richard greeted softly, motioning to the seat across from him. "Mr. Lansing," she said, sitting carefully, "you didn't have to do all this. I was fine." "No," he replied. "You weren't, and that's the problem. You shouldn't have had to be." She glanced around the massive office. Marble floors, chrome fixtures, panoramic views. "It's strange," she said quietly. "I used to clean this room every week. I never imagined I'd sit in it." Richard smiled faintly. "Neither did I once." He handed her a folder. "You're officially reinstated, but that's not why I asked you here. I need your help." "My help?" "Yes," he said. "I'm launching a new internal program, Project Mirror. It's meant to make sure no worker at any level becomes invisible again. You'll lead it. With your experience, your insight, you're exactly who we need." Her eyes widened. "I'm not qualified." "You're more qualified than most people who sit in this building," he interrupted gently. "You've lived what this company forgot to see." Angela stared at him, disbelief mixing with gratitude. "Why me? Because your son reminded me who I was before all this," Richard said, gesturing to the room. "Before the suits and numbers, before the walls got so high I couldn't see the ground anymore." There was a silence, one of understanding, deep and wordless. Finally, Angela nodded. "Then I'll help, but not for me, for everyone else still waiting for someone to see them." "Then let's start there," Richard said, standing. "From now on, no more false promises." As she left, the staff began to pour in. Some whispered, curious, surprised, even skeptical, as they saw her walking beside the CEO. But Richard didn't care. Later that afternoon, he drove back to the east side of the city. Eli was waiting outside their apartment, bouncing a scuffed basketball against the sidewalk. When he saw the Bentley, he froze, eyes wide. Richard stepped out and crouched beside him. "You have a good shot," he said with a smile. Eli blinked, still unsure. "You came back." "I told your mom I would," Richard said, "and I never break a promise twice." The boy tilted his head. "Is she okay now?" "She will be," Richard answered softly. "Because of you," Eli grinned. "Mom said you gave her a new job." Richard nodded. "And I might have one for you too, when you're older." Eli laughed, his eyes shining. "I want to be like you." Richard shook his head gently. "No, kid. Be better." They both laughed then, the tension of class, wealth, and circumstance fading into something simpler, humanity. Before leaving, Richard handed Eli something small, a keychain shaped like a star. "It's from my first company," he said. "Keep it. Remind me to stay grounded." Eli turned it in his hands, the metal gleaming. "You promise?" Richard smiled. "I promise." As the Bentley drove off, Richard glanced through the window. The boy stood waving until the car disappeared around the corner. For the first time, Richard didn't feel like a man driving away from a problem. He felt like a man driving toward redemption. That night, as city lights shimmered again beneath his penthouse, he looked at his reflection in the window. For the first time, the face staring back didn't look like a CEO. It looked like a man trying, finally, to remember what mercy looked like, and when he closed his eyes, he heard Eli's voice again, innocent, unwavering, filled with belief, promise. This time, it didn't sting. It inspired. Months passed. Lansing Global Holdings began to change, not in profit charts or stock reports, but in spirit. The janitors now ate lunch in the same cafeteria as the executives. The company's Project Mirror turned from an internal pilot into a nationwide initiative, and for the first time in decades, Richard Lansing's name appeared in the press not for wealth or deals, but for empathy. But for Richard, the real transformation wasn't in headlines. It was in his own heart. One grey November morning, he stood in the company auditorium, facing hundreds of employees gathered for the unveiling of the Lansing Promise Center, a foundation dedicated to helping families of laid-off workers, single parents and children in underprivileged neighborhoods. At the front row sat Angela Thompson and her son Eli, both dressed neatly. Eli's eyes sparkled with pride, his feet barely touching the floor. When the crowd hushed, Richard stepped to the podium. The lights cast a golden glow on his face, and for once, the billionaire who had spoken to investors and presidents felt nervous. He cleared his throat. "When I was a young man," he began, "I made a promise I didn't understand. I told one of my employees that I would never forget the people who built this company. But over time, I did. I became too focused on the top floors and forgot who kept the lights on below." A soft murmur rippled through the audience. Richard continued, his voice steady but emotional. "Some months ago, I met a boy outside this very building. He stopped me, not with anger but with a single word, promise. That word broke through years of noise, success and ego. It reminded me that wealth without compassion isn't wealth at all. It's emptiness dressed in gold." Angela lowered her head, holding back tears. Eli looked up at his mother, then at the man speaking on stage, the same man who had once seemed unreachable. Richard smiled gently. "That boy's courage changed me. It reminded me that humanity isn't measured by what we earn, but by what we give back." Applause spread through the hall, soft at first, then thunderous. Cameras flashed, employees stood. But Richard didn't bask in it. He simply turned toward Angela and Eli and said, "This is your legacy as much as mine." After the ceremony, Richard knelt beside Eli. "How's school?" he asked, his tone fatherly. Eli grinned. "Good. Mom got me a scholarship program from the Promise Center. They said I can go to any school I want someday." Richard chuckled. "That's the plan, champ." Eli looked thoughtful for a moment. "Mr. Lansing, can I ask something?" "Of course. Why'd you change?" "Most grown-ups don't." Richard smiled softly, his eyes distant. "Because one day, someone believed I still could." The boy's grin widened. "Was that me?" Richard's laugh was warm. "That was definitely you." Angela approached, her expression calm but full of pride. "He never stops talking about that day," she said. "He keeps saying, 'One word can change a man's whole world.'" Richard nodded. "It did." She placed a gentle hand on his arm. "You kept your promise." He met her gaze. "You and your son reminded me what it means to make one." As they turned to leave, Angela glanced back at the large banner behind the stage. The Lansing Promise Center, every life deserves to be seen. Outside, reporters gathered around Richard, asking questions about strategy, philanthropy, and branding. But none of that mattered to him anymore. He excused himself, walking past the microphones toward the parking lot, toward the Bentley that had once symbolized everything shallow in his life. He paused beside it. For a long time, he stared at his reflection in the car door. The same man looked back, yet not the same at all. His eyes were softer, his smile quieter. Eli ran up behind him, waving something small. "Hey, Mr. Lansing, you forgot this!" Richard turned. The boy held out the star keychain he'd once given him. "I was going to give it back," Eli said, "but Mom said you might still need it." Richard crouched and placed it back in the boy's hand. "No, Eli, you keep it. It belongs to the future now." Eli's smile was wide enough to light the cold November air. "Okay, but promise you'll visit us again?" Richard winked. "Promise." The boy ran back to his mother, and Richard stood there, watching them disappear down the sidewalk, two figures who had reminded him what it meant to be human. As he finally stepped into his Bentley, he didn't feel the weight of luxury anymore. He felt the weight of gratitude. The engine purred softly, and as he drove through the city, he saw faces differently now. The janitor sweeping the corner, the bus driver, the old woman crossing the street. He didn't see strangers. He saw stories. He saw worth. And he understood, at last, that redemption isn't found in money or titles. It's found in humility. At a red light, he looked up toward the clouds and whispered, "Thank you, Eli." The light turned green. The Bentley rolled forward, not toward wealth or fame, but toward a better legacy. And somewhere behind him, a small voice seemed to echo through the wind, soft and sure.